Hello and welcome to the first episode or first video of this channel. Here we're going to be talking about how different global events impact the day-to-day person and different groups of people. Oftentimes we see and read about different things that are happening around the nation, around the world, and don't know how they impact us, and therefore we tune them out most of the time. But in reality, those things do have grand implications on many different groups of people that sometimes go unnoticed and hence must be paid attention to. So for this first episode, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine and Russian war that's currently going on in the eastern regions of Europe. So for the beginning half of this video, I'm going to be talking about some background information one may want to use, the who, what, when, where, and why of this particular situation. And for the second half, we're going to be talking about the implications of what's happening right now and how they impact the student, the teenager, the adult, the working man, all these different groups of people, and why we should basically care about certain things that are happening around the world. So let's start with the who, what, when, where, and why. So the who is obviously between Russia and Ukraine. Their respective leaders are President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Vladimir Putin, who, like I said, rule and are in control over Ukraine and Russia, respectively. Surprisingly, we're also going to be talking about in this who, we're also going to be talking about Alaska, Western nations, and NATO nations. They have large implications. Alaska, you may not see why, but we'll talk more about that in the implications of the ongoing crisis. So we covered the who, now the what. Obviously, we know that there is a current Russian intervention and invasion into the nation of Ukraine, which looked unprovoked for many, and it really is unprovoked, but Russia has their own reasons for doing so, which we'll talk more about in the why. But on February 24th, 2022, Russian forces entered the eastern part of Ukraine, and under the guise of it being a, quote, special military operation. However, there was a lot more going on behind the scenes, and actually, if you look at satellite footage from the days before and after the invasion, you can actually see tanks and armored vehicles and different weaponry systems and troop tents lined around the border of Ukraine, which is why many people were, especially on the surveillance aspect of this, many people and many nations were starting to get concerned with why there was such a military backup, or rather a buildup, across the nation's border. And that's why many people thought that there was going to be an intervention. It was because there was this ramp up happening across the border. So the where is pretty self-explanatory. Ukraine, Russia border. We're going to be talking about the nation of Kiev. It's the city, the capital of Ukraine, and the area surrounding it. We're also going to be talking about Alaska, like I mentioned, and Western nations. Those include United States and Great Britain, France. All of these so-called civilized nations is what we would consider a Western nation, as well as any nations that are in the NATO organization. So the when now we've reached is started actually on February 24th, 2022, like I mentioned, and is ongoing. First, what happened was Vladimir Putin called this a special military operation. However, we clearly know that it had a much larger scale and a much larger implication than being just a special military operation. On the same day, the February 24th, 2022, Putin announced that he was going to assault Ukraine. The same day after he called it a special military operation, he just said that in a later speech, he's going to assault the people of Ukraine and defend the Russian people who are facing genocide from the residents of Kiev. Now, there's a couple things that are problematic in that. One of those being the city of Kiev is well within the nation of Ukraine. It's not near a border. So any skirmishes that are happening are not happening near Kiev. It's happening at the eastern front of the nation where it's in contact with Russia. The second thing is there's no genocide that's happening against the Russian people. In fact, it's Russia who's the aggressor in this entire situation. Even if you look back in history, Russia has a tendency to be an imperialistic nation dating back to the 16th century to Catherine the Great, and those tendencies don't stop. Even if you look recently into 2014, March of 2014, Russian invasion into the Crimean region, which ultimately ended up with the annexation of the Crimean region just slightly south of Ukraine, and that became Russian territory. So you see how Ukraine in this entire situation and in recent events and in history combined has not been the aggressor, rather Russia. So there's a couple hypocritical points that Russia is making in that. And finally, we talk about the why. Why is this happening? Why is Russia doing this now? And what was the intent behind Russia invading Ukraine to begin with? And it's slightly more complicated than many might seem it to be. Like I said, it furthers the habits of Russia as a nation to be an expansionist nation, an imperialistic nation, always looking to expand the power and the grasp of the control they have on the people who live under them. So that's one, they're power grabbing. And obviously I don't mean this in any negative light to the people. I'm talking of Russia, I'm talking about the administration, the leaders, and the oligarchs who are in charge of basically controlling the Russian government. And the other reason was that Putin claimed it was the Russian military seeks to denazify Ukraine, which is hypocritical in and of itself. But again, not enough of a reason to control a full assault level intervention into the region. So that's the background of what's happening. And as we speak, the Russian people are holding their ground, the Ukrainian people are holding their ground, especially in the capital city, which itself has not been taken by Russian forces, despite being vastly outnumbered by Russian forces. Ukrainian people are indeed holding strong. So that's where we're at today, and today is April 16th. So let's see where this takes us. Now for the second half of this video, the implications. How does this impact us in any way? And there's two major implications that I'm going to be categorizing this entire situation into. The first one is NATO/US involvement, and the second is gas prices and inflation. And obviously we've seen the latter and actually felt the implications of the latter in recent months and in recent days as well. So first, let's talk about NATO and US intervention. So NATO basically is it's a pact between nations that says unless one nation is attacked, one NATO nation is attacked by an outside force or an aggressor, then the other nations can't do much to help. And that's exactly what we're going to be seeing here with Ukraine. Ukraine is not part of NATO. Russia is not part of NATO. And unless Russian forces step foot into a NATO-backed nation or a nation that is in NATO or part of NATO, the other countries, including the United States, including Great Britain, who have all this great military superpower, cannot do anything to defend the people of Ukraine, even though we know it's morally wrong for this invasion to even be occurring. So the Biden administration is facing a lot of backlash for that, simply because of the fact that they're not doing anything. But there's one reason, and that's because Russian forces haven't set foot into a NATO-occupied area. And the second is that for the first time, we have two world superpowers, military superpowers, that are both nuclear weapon armed. Russia and United States combined host 80% of the world's nuclear weapons. So we can see how if the United States were to get involved in this crisis, Russia would obviously see this action as a form of aggression. And through the threats that Vladimir Putin has made, they're not against the idea of using nuclear weapons, and we know how that plays out. So that's the second reason why the United States is not getting involved. The last thing we're seeing is how Putin himself is spinning this into in his favor, and how it's kind of a paradox in what we see is happening. Putin is relying on the nuclear fear that's being built up in his threats against Ukraine and his threats against Western nations for helping Ukraine. He's using that nuclear fear to allow him to get away with invading this country. And really, there's no substance behind this, because as we know, he likely himself knows the implications of an all-out nuclear war and a nuclear winter that could happen after that. And he's using that fear in his favor. And he's relying on the fact that a nuclear-armed third party, or basically the United States, France, Great Britain, would not want to defend Ukraine, especially not after the fact that it's not a part of NATO, for risk that it's going to be an all-out nuclear war. So those are the implications for policymakers, for the administration in office right now, not only in the United States, but in other nations as well, and how and why we aren't intervening in such an immoral situation. The second, which might affect the consumer of any particular nation more than the policymakers, is gas prices and inflation. There's one critical thing that we must understand about gas prices, and oftentimes I feel like not many people understand this because they choose to blame a particular administration for hiked gas prices, for inflation, for all these things. And while it is partially the administration's fault, we have to understand that how gas works is on a global supply and demand basis. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the global demand was very low. Nobody was going out, nobody wanted to drive their cars around, so the demand for gas was low, but the supply was still there from before the pandemic began. So when demand is low and supply is high, the price per gallon or per barrel of oil itself is low. And we saw that as consumers during that time, gas prices were about $2.17 per gallon. And now we're seeing things as high as $4 or $5 per gallon. Why? Because now demand has increased, seeing that the pandemic is simmering down a little bit. People are willing to go out more. Demand has increased, but supply has not been able to catch up with that. The amount of oil that was being drilled out of the ground decreased because the demand wasn't there initially. Now we see more people want to buy gas, buy oil, and the gas companies aren't able to keep up with it. So when demand goes up and supply goes down, it creates scarcity, which means that the price per barrel of oil increases, which is exactly what we're seeing right now. But what makes this whole situation worse is that Russia we've cut off Western nations, including the United States, Great Britain, has cut off Russian oil, and Russian oil is Russia is one of the biggest exporters of crude oil, and ultimately gas. So when we have done that as a way to help Ukraine, it's harmed us the most. We see our gas prices going through the roof, and the problem is it's not harming Russia really, because they have all the gas to themselves and we're the ones with no gas. Ukraine is still being invaded. So who's the beneficiary in all of this? That's the question that policymakers need to understand. And that's why there's such a big hike in gas prices right now. It's the scarcity of it. There's very limited supply now that we've cut off Russian oil imports, and the demand is at an all-time high in the past 2 years. So in order to meet that level, the prices are obviously higher. The second thing about this is that the United States, amongst other nations, are looking to other oil exporting nations such as Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, to import oil from them to keep up with the demand that's currently happening. And this is where Alaska comes into play. I would like to point out the hypocrisy in this very situation, that the United States The only reason we do not frack our own oil or drill our own oil is for environmental reasons, but we are completely okay with drilling and taking oil from other nations at their environmental cost. Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, for example, we have emergency oil refinery or oil reserves in Alaska. This is where Alaska comes into play. But we don't use them for environmental reasons. But we're willing to take oil and buy oil from other nations. Isn't that the same cost environmentally? That's very hypocritical for the United States to even engage in, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. But ultimately, those are the implications for us. Our gas prices are still high, and just a side note, our food prices are going through the roof right now as well, because both Ukraine and Russia are main exporters of wheat, sunflower oil, and these are basics for obviously any grocery store and any household as well. So when they aren't able to export, we see that as on the consumer end as being problematic. And in fact, the United States Consumer Price Index has gone up 7.5% in the last 2 years because of this inflationary problems that the Russian-Ukraine situation is costing. So the implications are vast. Not only are gas prices very high right now, but the price of buying anything at a grocery store is also high right now because, again, demand is high as always, but supply is low. And that's why we're being filled. So that was the Russian-Ukrainian situation, the war going on right now, and how it has implications on the everyday average citizen of any Western nation. Let's tackle something next video. Yes, thank you.